The notification sound was innocent enough. Just a simple ping indicating files were syncing to my device. I glanced down at my phone screen, expecting to see my own photos backing up like they did every night when I connected to our home Wi-Fi. Instead, I watched in confusion as unfamiliar images began populating my camera roll. Pictures I didn't take. Places I'd never been. Moments I wasn't part of. My thumb hovered over the screen, frozen in that strange space between curiosity and dread, not yet understanding that the next few swipes would shatter everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Sometimes the truth doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it arrives quietly, disguised as a simple login error, downloading evidence one file at a time until there's no way left to pretend you don't see what's right in front of you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Parker, and 3 years ago I was living what everyone around me considered the perfect life in Seattle. I had a beautiful condo in Capitol Hill with views of Puget Sound, a husband who worked in commercial real estate development, and a comfortable existence that looked flawless from the outside. Ryan and I had been married for 6 years, together for 9 total, and we'd built what I thought was a solid foundation. We hosted dinner parties where friends envied our banter. We took annual trips to wine country that filled our social media with sun-drenched photos. We talked about starting a family soon, maybe next year, always next year. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which gave me flexibility but also meant my income was inconsistent and often dismissed as a hobby rather than a real career. Ryan never said it directly, but I felt the imbalance. He paid the mortgage. His name was on the condo deed. When we went out with his colleagues, I was introduced as his wife first, designer second, as if my professional identity was an afterthought worth mentioning only if conversation lagged. The evening everything changed started ordinarily enough. Ryan had texted earlier saying he'd be working late again, something about closing a major deal with a commercial property investor. This had become increasingly common over the past 4 months. Late nights at the office. Weekend conference calls. Business dinners that stretched until midnight. I'd felt the distance growing between us but attributed it to work stress. Real estate was competitive. He was ambitious. These things required sacrifice. That's what I told myself when I ate dinner alone for the 4th night that week, scrolling through Netflix trying to find something that could hold my attention longer than 10 minutes. I'd settled on a documentary about minimalism, ironic given that my marriage felt increasingly empty despite our material comfort, when my phone died mid-episode. I reached for Ryan's charging cable, the one he kept plugged in on his side of the couch, and connected my phone. That's when I noticed my device was acting strangely. Apps were updating that I'd already updated. Settings were reverting to configurations I didn't recognize. Then came the notifications. Photo after photo downloading to my camera roll. My first thought was that something had glitched with my iCloud account. Maybe a backup was restoring incorrectly. I opened my Photos app to investigate and immediately saw images that made no sense. Ryan at a restaurant I didn't recognize, dressed in the navy suit I'd helped him pick out last month, sitting across from a woman whose face was partially obscured by candlelight. Ryan on what appeared to be a hotel balcony, city lights twinkling behind him, his expression relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Ryan's hand intertwined with feminine fingers adorned with burgundy nail polish, a color I never wore. My heart began hammering against my ribcage as I scrolled further. More photos loaded in real time, syncing from wherever they were stored. A selfie of Ryan with a woman I now recognized as Vanessa Sterling, someone he'd mentioned casually as a new associate at his firm. Her head rested on his shoulder. His arm wrapped around her waist. The timestamp showed it was taken 2 weeks ago during a weekend he'd told me he was at a development conference in Portland. Another image showed them at what looked like a beach house, sunrise painting the sky behind them in shades of pink and gold. She wore one of Ryan's dress shirts and nothing else. He was kissing her temple. The intimacy of the gesture felt more violating than if I'd found explicitly sexual photos. This wasn't a drunken mistake. This was tender. This was ongoing. This was a relationship. I realized with dawning horror that I must have accidentally logged into Ryan's iCloud account instead of my own. He'd helped me troubleshoot my phone last week when it was acting up, and he must have entered his credentials without logging back out. Now his entire digital life was syncing to my device. Photos continued downloading. I watched like a bystander at an accident scene, unable to look away despite the carnage. Vacation photos from trips that supposedly overlapped with his work travel. Screenshots of text conversations with contact names I didn't recognize. Calendar invites for dinners and weekend getaways that never included me. The most recent photo was timestamped just 2 hours ago. Vanessa sitting in Ryan's car, his car that was supposedly parked at his office building downtown, laughing at something off camera. She wore a red dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. The location tag indicated they were in Bellevue, nowhere near his office. My hands trembled as I opened his messages, which were also now syncing to my device. The iCloud backup had given me access to everything. Conversations with Vanessa filled the screen, months of daily exchanges that painted a picture of a full relationship running parallel to our marriage. Good morning texts that he never sent me anymore. Inside jokes and pet names that made my stomach turn. Detailed plans for a weekend trip to Vancouver next month, complete with hotel reservations and restaurant bookings. A message thread from just 3 days ago where Vanessa sent a photo of a diamond ring with the caption, "Hint hint," followed by Ryan's response promising they'd talk about their future soon, once he figured out the cleanest way to handle his current situation. His current situation. That's what I was. Not his wife. Not his partner. A situation that needed handling. I scrolled back further, looking for the beginning of this betrayal, needing to understand when my marriage had become a lie. The messages with Vanessa started 7 months ago. Professional at first, discussing property listings and client meetings. Then slowly shifting to personal territory. Compliments on her presentation skills that felt too effusive. Suggestions to grab coffee that turned into lunch that evolved into dinners. The transition was gradual enough that I could see how easy it would have been for Ryan to rationalize each step. Just networking. Just building a professional relationship. Just being friendly with a colleague. Until suddenly it was selfies from hotel rooms and conversations about a shared future that erased me completely. But Vanessa wasn't the only name in his messages that caught my attention. There were texts with his mother, Diana Hayes, that made my blood run cold. Ryan's mother had never particularly warmed to me. She'd made it clear from early in our relationship that she'd hoped her son would marry someone with a more prestigious career, someone who came from the same country club background as their family. I'd tried for years to win her approval, showing up to every family dinner, remembering every birthday, biting my tongue when she made pointed comments about my work or background. Now I was reading messages where she actively encouraged his affair. Vanessa comes from a good family, one text read. Her father's connections could really help your career advancement. Sometimes we outgrow our starter marriages, sweetheart. There's no shame in pursuing what's right for your future. Starter marriage. As if our 6 years together were training wheels he could discard once he was ready for the real thing. Ryan had responded not with objection but with concerns about logistics. How to separate our finances with minimal loss. Whether the condo could be sold quickly or if he should simply buy out my interest at a lowball valuation since I'd contributed nothing to the down payment. His mother suggested he consult her attorney friend who specialized in protecting assets during divorce. They discussed timing like military strategists planning a campaign. Wait until after his performance review in June. Make sure the new development project was secured first. Perhaps suggest marriage counseling to establish a paper trail showing he'd tried to save the relationship. Every message revealed calculated planning where I'd seen only a distant but devoted husband working hard for our future. I sat on that couch for 2 hours, phone clutched in shaking hands, as my entire reality reconstructed itself around this new information. Every late night, every cancelled plan, every time he'd seemed distracted or distant now had context. The weekend last month when he'd been too exhausted to attend my best friend Kelsey's wedding with me, he'd actually been in San Francisco with Vanessa. The Valentine's Day when he'd given me grocery store flowers and a generic card, claiming work had been too crazy for proper planning, He'd sent Vanessa 24 roses and taken her to the restaurant where we'd had our first anniversary dinner. The night last week when I'd initiated intimacy and he'd claimed he was too tired, I now saw a text to Vanessa from the same evening describing how he couldn't wait to see her the next day. The sound of keys in the door lock jolted me from my paralysis. Ryan was home. I watched him enter, setting down his briefcase with the same gesture he performed thousands of times, loosening his tie as he walked toward the kitchen. He looked so normal, so familiar, this man I'd shared a life with for nearly a decade. For a surreal moment I wondered if I could just pretend I'd never seen any of it. Delete the evidence, log out of his iCloud, return to the comfortable fiction we'd been living. Some part of me desperately wanted to unknow what I now knew. "Sorry I'm so late," Ryan called out, his voice carrying the practiced exhaustion of someone establishing an alibi. The investors asked about 15 more revisions to the proposal. "I swear Thompson is trying to tank this entire deal." He appeared in the living room doorway, finally looking at me, and something in my expression must have registered because his casual demeanor faltered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Everything okay?" I held up my phone, screen facing him, displaying the most recent photo of him and Vanessa. "I accidentally logged into your iCloud," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the chaos raging inside me. "It's been downloading to my phone for the past 2 hours. All of it. The photos. The messages. Everything." The color drained from Ryan's face. He stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth opening and closing without sound, looking like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Finally he managed, "Natalie, I can explain." "Can you?" I stood, feeling strangely detached from my own body, as if I were watching this scene unfold from a distance. "Can you explain 7 months of lying? Can you explain planning your exit strategy with your mother while pretending we were working on starting a family? Can you explain being in Bellevue 2 hours ago when you were supposedly closing a deal downtown?" He moved toward me, hands raised in placation. "It's not what you think. Vanessa and we're just friends. Those photos, they're taken out of context." I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised us both. "Don't insult me by lying now. I've read your messages, Ryan. All of them. I know about Vancouver next month. I know about the ring. I know about your mother's attorney friend and the plan to buy me out of the condo at below market value." I watched his face cycle through emotions as he realized how completely exposed he was. "I know you've been calling our marriage your starter marriage. I never meant for you to find out like this," he said weakly, abandoning the pretense of innocence. "I was going to tell you. I just needed to get some things in order first." "Things in order," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. "You mean you needed to make sure all your assets were protected before you discarded me? How considerate." Ryan's expression shifted from panic to something harder, more defensive. "You want to talk about this now? Fine. Let's be honest, Natalie. We've been going through the motions for over a year. You know we have. When's the last time we had a real conversation that wasn't about groceries or bills? When's the last time you showed any interest in my career or ambitions beyond asking what time I'd be home for dinner?" The audacity of his deflection stole my breath. "You're blaming me for your affair? For 7 months of lying and planning to leave while still sleeping in our bed and pretending we had a future?" "I'm saying our marriage was already over," he countered, his voice rising with defensive anger. "We've been roommates for months. You've been so absorbed in your freelance projects, which barely bring in any money by the way, that you haven't noticed I've been pulling away. Vanessa actually cares about my goals. She understands the pressure I'm under. She's ambitious and driven in ways that complement my life trajectory." There it was. The truth beneath the betrayal. I wasn't enough. My career wasn't prestigious enough. My ambitions weren't aligned with his trajectory. I was the starter wife who'd served her purpose during his climb but had become dead weight now that he was reaching for higher rungs. "Does Vanessa know you're still married?" I asked quietly. Or is she under the impression you're already separated? His silence answered my question. She knows it's complicated, he finally offered. She understands that ending a marriage takes time and strategy. She's willing to wait for me to do this right. Do this right, I echoed. There's a right way to cheat on your wife and plan your escape while she's completely oblivious? I felt something inside me harden, crystallize into sharp resolve. Get out. What? Get out of this condo. Right now. Tonight. I walked to the door and opened it, standing beside it like a sentinel. Go stay with Vanessa. Or your mother. Or a hotel. I don't care. But you're not sleeping here tonight. Ryan's expression cycled between disbelief and indignation. This is my condo, Natalie. My name is on the deed. You can't kick me out of my own home. Watch me, I said with a calmness I didn't feel. You can come back tomorrow when I'm not here to get whatever you need. But tonight, right now, you leave. Or I start forwarding all these messages to everyone in your contact list, starting with the managing partners at your firm who probably have policies about workplace relationships and ethical conduct. The threat landed. Ryan's firm had strict fraternization guidelines, and an affair with a subordinate associate could jeopardize his position, especially if it could be framed as creating a hostile work environment or unfair advancement opportunities. You wouldn't, he said, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Try me, I challenged. You've spent months strategizing your exit to protect yourself. Did you really think I'd just accept being erased quietly? Get out, Ryan. Now. Before I stop being reasonable about this. He stared at me for a long moment, perhaps seeing me clearly for the first time in years, recognizing that the compliant wife who'd absorbed his mother's criticism and worked around his schedule was done accommodating. Finally, he grabbed his keys and wallet from the entry table. We're going to need to talk about this like adults eventually, he said stiffly. Division of assets, separation agreements. You can't just shut me out of my own property indefinitely. Call me tomorrow, I replied. We'll figure out the logistics. But tonight, you leave. That's non-negotiable. After he left, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the frame, I stood in the sudden silence of the condo feeling unmoored. The space that had been our home now felt like a stage set for a play that had closed without warning. I looked around at the furniture we'd picked together, the artwork on the walls, the kitchen where we'd cooked meals and argued about recipe modifications. Everything was contaminated by new knowledge. That couch where I'd discovered his betrayal. That dining table where he'd sat across from me discussing weekend plans while texting Vanessa about their next rendezvous. That bedroom where he'd lain beside me calculating the best timing for his departure. I called Kelsey, my hands shaking so badly I could barely swipe to her contact. She answered on the second ring, immediately detecting distress in my breathing. Nat? What's wrong? Ryan's been having an affair, I said, the words sounding absurd spoken aloud. For 7 months. With someone from his firm. I found out because I accidentally logged into his iCloud and everything downloaded to my phone. All the photos. All the messages. All the planning with his mother about how to leave me. Once I started talking, I couldn't stop. The words poured out in a torrent, 7 months of deception and tonight's confrontation spilling across the phone connection while Kelsey listened with occasional gasps of disbelief. I'm coming over, she said when I finally ran out of words. Right now. Don't argue. I'm already grabbing my keys. She arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of wine, a box of tissues, and the fierce loyalty that had sustained our friendship since college. We sat on the contaminated couch drinking wine from oversized glasses while I showed her the evidence still syncing to my phone. Photos continued downloading sporadically, each new image a fresh wound. Kelsey's expression grew darker with each swipe. His mother knew, she said with quiet fury. Diana actively helped him plan this. What kind of person does that to their daughter-in-law? She refilled our glasses with more aggression than necessary. You know what this means, right? You can't just separate quietly. You need a lawyer. A good one. Because they've been planning this for months, which means they've already figured out how to screw you in the division. I can't afford a lawyer, I admitted. Most of our money is in Ryan's accounts. I have maybe $8,000 in my personal savings. Everything else is joint or his. Kelsey pulled out her phone, already searching. My cousin went through a divorce 2 years ago. She had a lawyer who did an initial consultation for free and worked out a payment plan. Let me get you her contact information. You need someone fighting for you before Ryan and Diana execute whatever plan they've already developed. The next morning, Ryan returned while I was out walking aimlessly through the neighborhood trying to process my shattered reality. He'd texted asking for an hour to collect some belongings, and I'd agreed on the condition that he'd be gone before I returned. When I came back to the condo, I found he'd taken more than just clothes. His office was emptied of all electronics and files. Several pieces of furniture were missing, items he'd probably classified as his since he'd paid for them. Most telling, he'd removed the expensive artwork from the living room walls, pieces that had been gifts from his mother, leaving rectangular shadows on the paint like ghosts of our former life. A note sat on the kitchen counter, his handwriting precise and impersonal as a business memo. Natalie, I've retained legal counsel and suggest you do the same. My attorney will be reaching out regarding separation terms and property division. I think we can handle this civilly if you're reasonable about expectations. Given that the condo, vehicles, and majority of assets are in my name, I'm prepared to offer you a settlement that I believe is fair considering the circumstances. I'd like to have this resolved quickly so we can both move forward. Ryan. Reading his clinical language, his casual presumption that I'd accept whatever terms he deemed fair, ignited something in me that had been dormant through years of accommodating his needs above my own. I photographed the note, documenting his attempt to pressure me into a quick settlement before I'd even secured legal representation. Then I called the attorney Kelsey had recommended, a woman named Patricia Langford who specialized in protecting clients from exactly the kind of strategic divorce Ryan had been planning. Patricia met with me that afternoon in her downtown office, a space that radiated competent professionalism without ostentation. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and the direct gaze of someone who'd seen every manipulation tactic in the divorce handbook. I showed her everything. The downloaded photos and messages from Ryan's iCloud. The texts with his mother discussing strategy. His note attempting to pressure a quick settlement. The timeline of his affair running concurrent with our marriage counseling discussions. She listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing more focused as I detailed the past 24 hours. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. Your husband made several critical mistakes, she said crisply. First, having an affair with a coworker creates potential liability for his firm. Second, planning asset protection strategies before disclosing marital problems to you demonstrates bad faith negotiation. Third, that note trying to pressure a settlement before you've retained counsel shows intent to take advantage of your vulnerable position. She tapped her pen against her notepad. The iCloud evidence is particularly valuable. It demonstrates ongoing deception and financial planning specifically designed to minimize your share of marital assets. A court won't look kindly on that. Can I actually fight this? I asked, hearing the desperation in my voice. He's right that his name is on most everything. I haven't contributed much financially. I've been freelancing, which barely covers my personal expenses, let alone matching his income. Contributions to a marriage aren't solely financial, Patricia corrected firmly. You've been supporting his career advancement for 6 years, which in Washington state matters significantly in asset division. The fact that he systematically excluded you from property ownership while planning an exit strategy actually works in your favor. It demonstrates financial exploitation. She pulled out a legal pad and began outlining options. Here's what I recommend. We file immediately, establishing your claim to equitable distribution before he can further manipulate assets. We use the iCloud evidence to demonstrate bad faith, which impacts how a judge views his settlement offers. And we explore whether his firm has policies about workplace relationships that might apply leverage. Over the next 2 weeks, I learned more about legal strategy than I'd ever wanted to know. Patricia filed divorce papers that detailed Ryan's affair, his asset protection planning with his mother, and his attempt to pressure an inequitable settlement. We requested full financial discovery, requiring him to disclose all accounts, properties, and investments. The iCloud evidence proved invaluable, demonstrating that Ryan had been systematically preparing for divorce while still sharing my bed and discussing our supposed future together. Ryan's attorney responded with outrage, claiming I'd hacked his personal accounts and violated his privacy. Patricia shut that down swiftly, explaining that accidentally accessing an iCloud account on a shared device wasn't hacking, and that Ryan's own carelessness had exposed his deception. The evidence was admissible, and it painted a damning picture of someone who'd actively worked to disadvantage his spouse while pretending their marriage was merely troubled rather than already ended in his mind. The process was brutal. Ryan's mother hired her own attorney friend to consult on his case, someone skilled at aggressive divorce tactics. They contested every request, delayed every disclosure, and filed countermotions that forced us to spend time and money defending positions. Ryan's attorney painted me as a gold digger who'd contributed nothing to our marriage while enjoying the lifestyle his income provided. They emphasized that I'd brought no assets into the marriage, that my freelance career was essentially a hobby, and that I was attempting to profit from the dissolution of a relationship I'd neglected. The attacks were personal and devastating. They dredged up every insecurity I'd ever felt about my career and contributions. Patricia kept me focused on facts rather than emotions. "They're hoping you'll get hurt and angry enough to make mistakes," she reminded me during a particularly vicious round of depositions. "Stay calm. Stay factual. Let the evidence speak for itself." 4 months into the legal battle, we reached a mediation session where both parties would attempt settlement before going to trial. I sat across a conference table from Ryan for the first time since the night I'd kicked him out. He looked different somehow. Harder. Vanessa wasn't present, but her influence showed in his updated wardrobe and the confident way he presented his position. He wanted me to take a lump sum of $50,000 and walk away from all claims to the condo, his retirement accounts, and any future earnings from investments we'd made during the marriage. "That's insulting," Patricia said flatly before I could respond. "Your client spent 6 years benefiting from my client's domestic and emotional labor while building his career. He systematically excluded her from asset ownership while planning an exit strategy. $50,000 doesn't come close to equitable distribution under Washington law." The negotiations stretched through the afternoon, Ryan's attorney arguing that my lack of financial contribution justified minimal payout, Patricia countering that my support of his career and his bad faith planning warranted substantial division. We finally reached a settlement as the sun was setting outside the conference room windows. I would receive $175,000, half of Ryan's retirement account accumulated during our marriage, and his agreement not to contest my claim to half the increase in the condo's value during our years together. It wasn't what Patricia had pushed for, but it was substantially more than Ryan's initial insulting offer. Walking out of that mediation, legally separated with a settlement pending the final decree, I felt hollowed out. I'd spent 4 months fighting for recognition of my contributions to a marriage that had apparently been over long before I'd discovered the truth. I'd defended my worth against attacks from someone who'd once promised to honor me. I'd learned exactly how little I'd mattered in the grand scheme of Ryan's ambitions. The settlement money felt less like victory and more like acknowledgement that our years together had some value, even if that value could be reduced to a dollar amount and divided like furniture. The finalized divorce papers arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to the tiny studio apartment I'd rented in Fremont after moving out of the condo. I signed for the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking weeks ago, feeling nothing but a dull acceptance as I flipped through the legal documentation that officially ended my marriage. The apartment around me reflected my stripped-down existence, a futon that served as both couch and bed, a folding table that functioned as desk and dining surface, cardboard boxes still unpacked because I couldn't decide if this was temporary housing or the beginning of something permanent. The settlement money sat in my bank account like a question I didn't know how to answer. $175,000 felt simultaneously like a fortune and an insult. It was more money than I'd ever had access to at once, yet it represented 6 years of my life reduced to a sum that wouldn't even cover a down payment on a decent house in Seattle's inflated market. I'd opened a savings account separate from anything connected to Ryan, watching the numbers on my phone screen and feeling disconnected from their reality. This was supposed to be my fresh start capital, but I had no idea what kind of start to make. Kelsey had been pushing me to use the money wisely, by which she meant invest it or at least park it somewhere it could grow while I figured out my next move. But wisdom felt beyond my capacity those first weeks after the divorce finalized. I spent most days in my apartment, taking freelance design projects that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, watching the world outside my window like someone observing life through glass. Depression had settled over me like a weighted blanket, making even simple decisions feel exhausting. Should I buy real furniture or keep living like a college student? Should I stay in Seattle where every neighborhood held memories, or start over somewhere new? Should I try to rebuild my design career or admit that maybe Ryan and his mother had been right about it being more hobby than profession? The isolation was suffocating. Most of our coupled friends had quietly sided with Ryan, or at least stopped including me in social gatherings where my presence would create awkwardness. I'd stopped posting on social media entirely after seeing photos from a dinner party at the home of people I'd considered close friends, Ryan and Vanessa there among the smiling faces, apparently already accepted as the new normal couple. My phone barely rang anymore. Days passed where the only human voice I heard was Kelsey's during our nightly check-in calls, her concern growing more evident as I deflected her questions about how I was really doing. One particularly dark evening, I sat on my futon scrolling through job listings with growing despair. Every graphic design position in Seattle required skills I was rusty on or experience with software I couldn't afford. The listings that matched my qualifications paid barely more than I was making freelancing, and many came with the kind of corporate constraints that had driven me to freelance work in the first place. I was 32 years old, newly divorced, living in a studio apartment that smelled faintly of the Indian restaurant downstairs, with a career that seemed to be going nowhere despite my degree and years of experience. The future stretched ahead of me like a blank page I had no idea how to fill. Kelsey appeared at my door the next morning unannounced, carrying coffee and bagels and wearing the expression of someone preparing for an intervention. She took one look at my apartment, at me in the same sweatpants I'd been wearing for 3 days, at the collection of takeout containers accumulating on my counter, and her face settled into determined resolve. "Okay," she said, setting down breakfast and opening my curtains to let in light I'd been avoiding. "We need to have a real conversation about what happens next. And I need you to actually be present for it, not just agreeing with whatever I say, so I'll leave you alone." I wanted to be defensive, to insist I was fine and handling things in my own way. Instead, I found myself crying, really crying for the first time since the divorce finalized. Not the angry tears of betrayal or the frustrated tears of legal battles, but the deep grief of someone mourning not just a marriage but an entire version of herself that no longer existed. Kelsey held me while I sobbed, not offering platitudes or solutions, just solid presence until the storm passed. When I finally pulled away, embarrassed and exhausted, she handed me coffee and sat across from me with gentle firmness. "Here's what I see," she said carefully. "You're stuck. You're treading water in a city that reminds you of everything you lost, in an apartment that feels temporary, doing work that doesn't challenge you, waiting for something to change. But nothing's going to change unless you make it change, Nat. You have money in the bank and no real ties keeping you here. Why are you staying?" The question hung in the air. Why was I staying? Inertia, maybe. Fear of making another mistake. Some irrational hope that if I stayed put, my life would somehow reassemble itself into a recognizable shape. "I don't know where else to go," I admitted. "Everything I know is here. My contacts, my clients, the few friends I have left. Starting over somewhere new feels like admitting defeat. Or it's admitting that this chapter is finished and you're ready for the next one," Kelsey countered. "You know what I think? I think you need to get out of Seattle completely. Not forever necessarily, but long enough to get perspective. Somewhere different enough that you're not constantly running into reminders. Somewhere you can figure out who Natalie is separate from who you were in that marriage." The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Leave Seattle entirely? Go somewhere I didn't know anyone, where no one knew my story or had opinions about my divorce? It felt reckless and also exactly right. Where would I even go? I asked, testing the idea aloud. I don't have family anywhere else. No job prospects outside Seattle. Kelsey pulled out her phone, already prepared with research. Austin, she said, showing me articles about the city's growing creative industry. Huge tech scene, tons of startups needing design work, cost of living way lower than Seattle, and completely different vibe. One of my college roommates moved there 2 years ago and loves it. Says it's full of transplants reinventing themselves. Plus, the weather doesn't make you want to hibernate 9 months a year. I looked at the photos on her screen. Bright sunshine, colorful street art, outdoor cafes filled with people who looked young and energetic and optimistic about their futures. It looked nothing like the gray Seattle spring outside my window. It looked like possibility. That's crazy, I said, but I was already imagining it. Packing my few belongings, pointing my car south, arriving in a city where no one knew I was the woman whose husband had left her for someone more ambitious. I can't just pick up and move to Texas on a whim. Why not? Kelsey challenged. What's actually stopping you? You don't have a lease here beyond month to month. Your freelance work is all remote anyway. You've got savings that could support you for a year if you're careful. And most importantly, you're miserable here. What's the worst that could happen in Austin? You hate it and come back? At least you'd know you tried. The worst that could happen felt like it had already happened. My marriage had imploded. My self-worth had been systematically demolished. I'd spent 4 months fighting for scraps of recognition from someone who'd stopped valuing me long before I'd known we were ending. How much worse could trying something new actually be? That night, I lay awake on my futon researching Austin with an intensity one hadn't felt about anything in months. I read about neighborhoods and job markets and cultural scenes. I looked at apartment listings and calculated budgets. I joined online groups for Austin transplants and read their stories of reinvention. The more I learned, the more the idea shifted from impossible to merely terrifying to almost exciting. 3 days later, I gave notice on my apartment. 2 weeks after that, I loaded everything I owned into my 12-year-old Honda Civic and began the 29-hour drive to Austin, Texas. I'd found a short-term rental in the South Congress District, a small garage apartment behind an older couple's main house that was affordable and available immediately. I had no job lined up, no friends waiting, no real plan beyond arriving and figuring things out as they came. Kelsey had cried when I left, making me promise to call every day and to come back if things didn't work out, but even her worry couldn't dampen the strange lightness I felt as Seattle disappeared in my rear-view mirror. The drive itself became a kind of meditation. Long stretches of highway where I was alone with my thoughts, processing the past year while watching the landscape gradually transform from Pacific Northwest forests to Southwest desert. I stopped at random roadside motels, eating truck stop food and sleeping in beds that belonged to no one's history but the thousands of travelers who'd passed through before me. I was anonymous. Temporary. In transit between identities. It felt appropriate. Austin hit me like a wall of heat when I arrived in late May. Stepping out of my air-conditioned car into 98-degree sunshine felt like entering a different planet after Seattle's perpetual gray drizzle. My new landlords, Helen and Jorge Martinez, greeted me with cold lemonade and genuine warmth, showing me to the garage apartment that would be my home for at least the next few months. The space was small but charming, with hardwood floors and big windows that let in floods of light. It came furnished with basics, which was good since I'd left most furniture behind in Seattle, taking only what fit in my car. Austin takes some getting used to if you're not from here, Helen said as she showed me how to work the temperamental air conditioning unit. The heat, the traffic, the way everyone's always talking about tacos and breakfast burritos. But it's a good city for fresh starts. Half the people here came from somewhere else. You'll fit right in. The first week was disorienting. Everything was different, the landscape, the architecture, the food, even the way people talked. I spent days just walking around my neighborhood, getting familiar with streets that had no emotional history. I found coffee shops where I could work on my laptop without memories of conversations I'd rather forget. I discovered Barton Springs Pool, a natural spring-fed swimming hole where I could float in cool water while the Texas sun beat down overhead, surrounded by locals and tourists who knew nothing about me except that I was there in that moment. But practicality couldn't be avoided forever. My savings account balance was slowly diminishing. I needed income. I updated my portfolio website, reaching out to Austin-based companies and startups looking for freelance design work. The market was competitive, flooded with talented designers from across the country who'd made the same pilgrimage I had. My Seattle credentials meant nothing here. I was starting from scratch, competing against people with fresh skills and local connections. The rejection emails accumulated. Position filled. Moving forward with other candidates. Budget constraints eliminated the role. Not the right fit at this time. Each one chipped away at my fragile confidence. Maybe Ryan had been right. Maybe my design work was amateur. Maybe I'd made a catastrophic mistake leaving everything familiar to chase some fantasy of reinvention in a city that didn't want or need me. 2 months into my Austin experiment, my savings had dwindled to a level that triggered real anxiety. I'd found occasional freelance gigs, enough to cover rent and basic expenses, but nothing substantial. Nothing that felt like building toward anything. I was living in a holding pattern, suspended between my past and an uncertain future that refused to materialize. Then I saw a job posting that made me pause. A tech startup called Catalyst Solutions was looking for a junior designer for their product team. The position was technically below my experience level and paid less than I'd been hoping to make, but something about the company's mission resonated. They focused on creating software solutions for small businesses and nonprofits, organizations often priced out of custom tech development. The job description emphasized collaboration, growth potential, and creativity over purely technical skills. I spent 3 days perfecting my application, crafting a cover letter that was honest about being new to Austin and looking for somewhere to build roots while contributing to meaningful work. I included portfolio pieces that showed my range and my ability to solve visual communication problems, not just make things look pretty. I hit submit with minimal hope, having learned that most applications disappeared into digital voids without acknowledgement. The response came 36 hours later. An invitation to interview with the creative director, someone named Marcus Chin. The email was personable, mentioning specific portfolio pieces he'd appreciated and asking me to bring examples of my design process, not just finished products. It felt different from the corporate interview requests I'd received before. I arrived at Catalyst Solutions' office 15 minutes early, dressed in my most professional outfit, which was showing wear from the past year's stress. The office was in East Austin, in a converted warehouse space that had been transformed into an open floor plan with natural light and plants everywhere. Employees worked at standing desks or gathered in casual seating areas, the atmosphere relaxed but focused. It felt nothing like the corporate offices I'd visited in Seattle. Marcus Chin met me in the lobby, younger than I'd expected, maybe late 30s, with glasses and an easy smile that immediately put me at ease. We moved to a small conference room where he asked me to walk him through my portfolio, but not in the usual way. He wanted to know about projects that had failed, about times I'd had to compromise my vision, about how I handled feedback and revision requests. "I'm less interested in your best work than in how you work," he explained. "Anyone can have a beautiful portfolio piece where everything went perfectly. I want to know how you handle the messy reality of design in a business environment where there are constraints and stakeholders and deadlines that sometimes mean settling for good enough." His honesty surprised me into reciprocal honesty. I talked about challenging clients, about projects where budget limitations meant creative problem solving, about learning to balance artistic vision with practical business needs. I mentioned being new to Austin, framing it as a fresh start without detailing why I'd needed one. He nodded thoughtfully, asking follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening rather than checking boxes on an evaluation form. "Why Catalyst?" he asked finally. "You're overqualified for this junior position. You could probably get higher-paying work elsewhere." I considered giving a diplomatic answer about believing in the company's mission. Instead, I found myself being truthful. "Because I need somewhere to rebuild," I said. "The past year has been rough personally, and I'm trying to figure out who I am professionally separate from that. Your company's values about making technology accessible resonated with me. And honestly, I'd rather take a junior position somewhere I respect than a senior role somewhere I'm just collecting a paycheck." Marcus studied me for a moment, then smiled. "I appreciate that honesty. Let me be equally honest. This position is entry-level because we're a small startup operating on tight margins. The hours can be long when we're approaching deadlines. The work isn't always glamorous. But if you're someone who wants to grow and isn't afraid of learning, there's real opportunity here. We're expanding, and people who prove themselves can advance quickly. He offered me the position that same afternoon. The salary was modest, but it included health insurance and the promise of equity if I stayed past a year. I accepted immediately, feeling something shift in my chest. This wasn't just a job. It was the first concrete piece of my new life clicking into place. Starting at Catalyst Solutions felt like learning to walk again after being bedridden. Everything was unfamiliar: the software they used, the workflow processes, the team dynamics. I was the newest member of a tight-knit creative team that had been working together for over a year. They had inside jokes and established rhythms that I disrupted simply by being there. For the first 2 weeks, I felt perpetually lost, asking questions that probably seemed basic, making mistakes that revealed my inexperience with their particular systems. Marcus proved to be a patient mentor. He'd check in daily, not in an overbearing way but with genuine interest in how I was adjusting. He'd redirect me when I went down wrong paths, explain context I was missing, and gradually give me more responsibility as I proved I could handle it. The rest of the team warmed up slowly, testing me with small collaborative projects before including me in bigger initiatives. My first major project was redesigning the interface for a nonprofit client's donor management system. The existing design was functional but unintuitive, created by developers who understood code but not user experience. My job was to make it accessible for nonprofit staff who weren't tech-savvy while maintaining all the complex functionality. It required dozens of iterations, user testing sessions where I watched people struggle with my designs and had to swallow my ego while incorporating their feedback, and compromise between my aesthetic vision and practical usability needs. The night before the client presentation, I stayed late refining the final mock-ups. Most of the office had emptied, but Marcus was still there, working on a different project. He came by my desk around 8, looking at the screens displaying my work. "This is really strong," he said, scrolling through the interface designs. "You've managed to simplify complexity without losing functionality. That's harder than it looks." He pulled up a chair, studying my process sketches pinned to my cubicle wall. "You know, when I first saw your portfolio, I could tell you were talented. But talent isn't what makes someone succeed here. It's the willingness to iterate, to accept that your first idea probably isn't your best idea, to collaborate without ego. You've shown all of that these past 2 months." The compliment landed differently than praise from Ryan ever had. This was recognition of my actual work and growth, not generic flattery meant to placate. "I'm still figuring things out," I admitted. "Every project reveals how much I don't know." "That's called growth," Marcus replied. "The people who think they know everything are the ones who stop improving. You're doing better than you realize, Natalie." He stood to leave, then paused. "We're having a team dinner Friday night. Nothing fancy, just tacos and drinks. You should come. I know it's hard being the new person, but everyone likes you. They're just not sure if you like them yet." The invitation surprised me. I'd been so focused on proving myself professionally that I hadn't considered the social dimension of joining a new workplace. "I'll be there," I promised, feeling a small crack forming in the isolation I'd wrapped around myself since arriving in Austin. The client presentation went well. The nonprofit director loved the redesigned interface, particularly how we'd made complex data visualizations accessible. They approved the designs with minimal revision requests, which Marcus later told me was rare. The victory felt earned in a way my freelance work never had. This wasn't just making something look nice for a paycheck. This was solving real problems for organizations trying to do good work with limited resources. The team dinner that Friday became a turning point. Sitting around a table at a Mexican restaurant in East Austin, sharing queso and margaritas with people who'd started as strangers, I felt the first genuine laughter I'd experienced in months. They told stories about Catalyst's early days, about projects that had failed spectacularly, about the time their server crashed an hour before a major presentation. Marcus revealed that he'd started Catalyst after leaving a high-paying corporate job that had left him feeling empty, choosing meaningful work over prestige and money. "We've all got reasons for being here instead of somewhere more conventional," he said, gesturing around the table. "Catalyst attracts people who want their work to matter, even if it means making less money or having less impressive titles. You fit that profile." Walking back to my car that night, slightly buzzed from margaritas and genuine human connection, I realized I'd gone hours without thinking about my divorce or Ryan or the life I'd left behind in Seattle. This was the first evidence that my decision to leave hadn't been running away from something but toward something. Toward people who valued contribution over status. Toward work that felt meaningful. Toward a version of myself that could exist independent of past failures. The next month settled into a rhythm. Work at Catalyst during the day, gradually taking on more complex projects and more responsibility. Evenings exploring Austin, discovering neighborhoods and restaurants and music venues. Weekends at Barton Springs or hiking the Greenbelt trails, my body slowly adapting to the relentless heat. I made friends tentatively, people from work and neighbors and regulars at my favorite coffee shop. I kept things surface level, not ready to share my full story but no longer hiding in complete isolation. Kelsey visited for a long weekend in September, eager to see this new life I'd built. I showed her around Austin, introducing her to my favorite spots and my work friends. She met Marcus briefly when she stopped by the office to take me to lunch, the interaction casual and friendly. After Kelsey left, she pulled me aside at the airport and said something that stayed with me. "You look different. Not just happier, though you do. You look like yourself again. Like the person you were before you spent years trying to fit into someone else's idea of who you should be." Her words echoed as I drove back into the city, watching the Austin skyline appear on the horizon. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was finally becoming someone authentic rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. Work at Catalyst continued expanding my capabilities in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus had a habit of throwing me into situations slightly beyond my comfort zone, not to watch me fail but to push growth. 6 months into my tenure, he assigned me to lead a redesign project for a local environmental nonprofit, my first time managing a project from initial client consultation through final delivery without direct oversight. The responsibility terrified and energized me equally. The client was a woman named Dr. Patricia Langford, though she insisted everyone call her Patricia. She ran an organization focused on urban sustainability initiatives, and their website was a cluttered mess of good intentions and poor user interface design. Our first meeting took place at a coffee shop near the university, Patricia arriving with a battered laptop covered in stickers and an apologetic expression. "I know it's terrible," she said, pulling up their current site. "We built it ourselves 5 years ago using a template, and we've just kept adding things without any real strategy. But we're applying for a major grant, and the foundation specifically mentioned that our online presence needed to reflect the professionalism of our actual work." I spent 2 hours with her that morning, asking questions about their audience, their goals, their brand identity. Patricia was brilliant and passionate, with the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made you want to help her succeed. She talked about their programs bringing community gardens to food deserts, their educational initiatives teaching sustainable practices in public schools, their advocacy work pushing for better environmental policies at the city level. Her organization was doing genuinely important work, hampered only by their inability to communicate it effectively online. "I want people to visit our site and immediately understand why this work matters," Patricia said as we wrapped up. "Not just what we do, but why it's urgent and how they can be part of it. Can you do that?" I promised to try, feeling the weight of responsibility and the thrill of a challenge that actually meant something. This wasn't designing another corporate website to sell products nobody needed. This was helping amplify work that made Austin a better place to live. The project consumed me for the next 6 weeks. I conducted user research, interviewing people who'd participated in their programs to understand what had drawn them in. I studied other successful nonprofit sites, identifying patterns in how they balanced emotional appeal with practical information. I created wireframes and mock-ups, testing different approaches to organizing their complex array of programs and initiatives. Marcus checked in periodically, offering suggestions but largely letting me navigate the challenges myself. The breakthrough came during a particularly frustrating evening when nothing was clicking visually. I'd been approaching the design too conventionally, treating it like any other nonprofit site. What made Patricia's organization special was their grassroots, community-driven approach. Their work happened in neighborhoods, in schools, in backyard gardens. The website needed to reflect that intimate, human scale rather than trying to project institutional authority. I redesigned everything around stories and faces. Instead of leading with statistics about sustainability, the homepage featured rotating profiles of community members whose lives had been changed by the programs. Navigation was organized around the question, "How do you want to help?" rather than traditional categorical structure. Photography showcased real gardens, real students, real neighborhoods rather than stock images of generic environmental themes. The color palette drew from Austin itself, the green of live oak trees, the blue of Barton Springs, the warm terracotta of local architecture. When I presented the final designs to Patricia, she cried. Actually cried, sitting in our conference room looking at the mock-ups on the large monitor. "This is exactly what I couldn't articulate but desperately needed," she said, wiping her eyes and laughing at her emotional response. "You've captured not just what we do but who we are." "How did you understand that?" "I paid attention," I answered simply. "To what you said, what you didn't say, what made your voice change when you talked about different aspects of the work. The design is just translating that into visual language." Patricia's website launched 2 weeks before their grant application deadline. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Traffic to their site increased by 300% in the first week. Volunteer applications flooded in. People shared it on social media with comments about finally understanding what the organization actually did. Most importantly, they got the grant, a 6-figure award that would fund expansion of their programs throughout Travis County. Patricia credited the website redesign as a significant factor in the foundation's decision, and she became one of Catalyst's most enthusiastic advocates, recommending us to other nonprofits in her network. Marcus called me into his office the day after the grant announcement. "You know that project was a test, right?" he said, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "Not a setup for failure, but a chance to see if you were ready for the next level. You proved you were." He offered me a promotion to senior designer, which came with a salary increase, more autonomy, and the opportunity to mentor junior designers as the company expanded. "We're growing faster than I anticipated," Marcus explained. "The nonprofit sector has been particularly responsive to our approach. I need people who can lead projects, manage client relationships, and help shape our creative direction. You've shown you can do all of that." The promotion felt earned in a way professional advancement never had in my marriage. Ryan had often talked about my work with a patronizing tone, as if my design career was a cute distraction rather than a real profession. His acknowledgement of my contributions had always felt conditional, dependent on my not demanding too much attention or resources that might detract from his own ambitions. Marcus's recognition was different. It was based on observable results and demonstrated capabilities. I wasn't being promoted because someone felt obligated or wanted to placate me. I was advancing because I'd proven my worth. The months that followed brought new challenges as I adjusted to leadership responsibilities. I hired and trained 2 junior designers, learning that teaching others forced me to articulate instincts I'd previously just followed. I presented at client meetings, representing Catalyst and having my recommendations trusted and implemented. I participated in company strategy discussions, my input valued alongside more experienced voices. Each success built confidence that had been systematically destroyed during my marriage and subsequent divorce. Austin itself had become home in ways Seattle never quite had. I'd upgraded from the garage apartment to a small house I was renting in the Bolden Creek neighborhood, a quirky area full of artists and musicians and people who'd chosen creativity over conventional success. I had a back porch where I could sit in the evenings, a small garden where I was attempting to grow tomatoes with mixed results, and neighbors who knew my name and invited me to their occasional block parties. Kelsey had been right about Austin being full of people reinventing themselves. Nobody asked too many questions about your past. What mattered was who you were now and what you were building toward. My friendship with Marcus had deepened naturally over time, evolving from purely professional mentorship into genuine personal connection. We'd fallen into a habit of staying late on Thursday evenings, ostensibly to review the week's work but often drifting into conversations about everything else. He told me about his journey from corporate finance to startup founder, about the relationship that had ended when he'd chosen purpose over profit, about his complicated relationship with his family who still didn't understand why he'd walked away from a six-figure salary. I found myself sharing more of my own story than I'd intended, the words coming easier in the quiet of the mostly empty office. I told him about the iCloud discovery, about watching my marriage download itself as evidence of betrayal, about the divorce battle and the way it had forced me to fight for basic recognition of my worth. Marcus listened without judgment or platitudes, asking thoughtful questions that helped me process experiences I'd mostly just tried to move past. "You know what strikes me about your story," he said one evening as we sat in the office kitchen sharing takeout. "You talk about that marriage like it was something that happened to you rather than something you participated in. Like you were a supporting character in someone else's narrative." His observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. "I guess I was," I admitted. "I spent years accommodating Ryan's schedule, his career priorities, his vision of what our life should look like. I shaped myself around what he needed, and then he left anyway because I still wasn't the right shape." "And now?" Marcus asked. "Who are you shaping yourself around now?" The question hung in the air between us. I realized with sudden clarity that for the first time in years, I was making choices based on my own values and interests. The work I was doing mattered to me independent of anyone else's approval. The life I was building in Austin reflected my priorities, not compromises with someone else's competing vision. I was finally the main character in my own story. "I'm figuring that out," I said softly. "But it feels right in a way nothing has in a long time." Something shifted between us that night, a recognition of connection that went beyond professional respect or casual friendship. We didn't name it or act on it, both cautious for different reasons. Marcus had been hurt by someone who'd left when his career change meant less money and status. I was still processing the wreckage of a marriage that had taught me to doubt my judgment about relationships. But the awareness was there, humming beneath our interactions with increasing frequency. The shift became impossible to ignore during a company retreat Marcus organized that winter. Catalyst had grown to 15 employees, and he'd rented a house in the hill country for a long weekend focused on team building and strategic planning. The setting was beautiful, rolling landscape dotted with live oak trees, a house with expansive decks overlooking a valley, and weather perfect for outdoor activities. During a group hike on Saturday morning, Marcus and I ended up walking together, naturally falling back from the main group as we navigated the trail at a slower pace, deep in conversation about a new project direction he was considering. The discussion evolved into broader questions about the company's future, about balancing growth with maintaining the values that made Catalyst special, about how to scale impact without losing the personal touch that clients appreciated. "I worry about becoming what I left," Marcus confessed as we paused at an overlook, the trail stretching out below us. "That corporate job I had, it started with good intentions. The company had a mission statement about making finance accessible and ethical. But growth meant compromise, and compromise meant slowly betraying the values that had attracted me in the first place. I don't want that to happen with Catalyst." "Then don't let it," I said with more conviction than I felt. "You get to make those choices. Nobody's forcing you to accept projects that don't align with your values, or hire people who don't share the vision, or prioritize profit over purpose. It's not that simple once investors get involved," he replied. "And we'll need investment capital soon if we want to expand the way I'm envisioning. That means answering to people who care more about returns than impact." I thought about Ryan and his real estate development firm, about how every decision had been filtered through calculations of profit and career advancement, about how human considerations had always been secondary to financial outcomes. "Then don't take investor money that comes with strings you can't accept," I suggested. "Grow slower if that's what it takes to maintain control. Stay small if small means staying true to what matters." Marcus turned to look at me, something intense and unguarded in his expression. "You get it. That's rare. Most people think I'm being naive or impractical when I talk about prioritizing impact. They see business as fundamentally about maximizing returns, and anything else is just marketing." "Those people haven't built anything they actually believe in," I said. They've only optimized systems someone else created. What you're doing is different. It's harder, but it's real. We stood there for a long moment, the Texas landscape sprawling around us, something unspoken but undeniable passing between us. Then the rest of the group called from down the trail, and we continued walking, but the air felt different, charged with possibility neither of us was quite ready to acknowledge aloud. That evening, the team gathered around a fire pit behind the house, sharing stories and jokes loosened by good food and wine. Someone asked Marcus how he'd come up with the name Catalyst Solutions, and he launched into the story of brainstorming sessions with his co-founder, the dozens of terrible names they'd considered, finally landing on Catalyst because it captured their vision of being the element that enables change without being consumed in the process. We wanted to help organizations do work they couldn't do alone, Marcus explained, flames casting dancing shadows across his face. Not to take credit for their success, but to provide the tools and support that let them achieve their potential. That's what a catalyst does in chemistry. It enables reactions that wouldn't happen otherwise. Later, as people began drifting off to bed, Marcus and I ended up alone by the dying fire, wrapped in blankets against the night chill. The conversation had moved from work to more personal territory, trading stories from our pasts, laughing about early career disasters and cringe-worthy dating experiences. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus said during a comfortable silence. "You don't have to answer if it's too invasive." I nodded, curious and slightly nervous about where this might lead. "Do you ever talk to your ex-husband?" he asked. "I know it ended badly, but after nearly a decade together, is there any remaining connection?" "No," I answered without hesitation. "I haven't spoken to Ryan since the day our divorce finalized. He tried to reach out a few times in the first months, mostly about logistical things he claimed to need closure on, but I think really just wanting to assuage guilt or maintain some kind of connection." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. No curiosity about how his life turned out. Marcus pressed gently. "Whether he's still with the woman he left you for, whether the career he prioritized over your marriage actually brought him what he wanted?" I considered the question honestly. Sometimes I wonder in an abstract way, but I don't actually care enough to investigate. Whatever Ryan is doing, whoever he's become, it's not my concern anymore. I spent too many years making his life my focus. Now I'm focused on building something that's actually mine. Marcus nodded slowly, firelight reflecting in his eyes. "That's healthy." I still sometimes check my ex's social media, which I know is unhealthy, but I can't seem to stop torturing myself with updates about her life. She's engaged now to someone in the finance world, living exactly the conventional successful life she wanted. The life she left me for not wanting. Does it hurt? I asked quietly. "Seeing her happy without you?" "Less than it used to," he admitted. "Mostly it just confirms we wanted fundamentally different things. She needed security and status. I needed meaning and autonomy. Neither of us was wrong, but we were incompatible. I just wish we'd figured that out before I'd invested 3 years thinking we could compromise our way to compatibility." The vulnerability in his admission made me bold enough to voice something I'd been feeling for weeks. "You know what's strange? I'm almost grateful to Ryan for the betrayal. Not for how it happened, but for forcing me to leave and rebuild. I was so comfortable being unhappy in Seattle, just existing in this liminal space where nothing was terrible enough to justify change but nothing was good enough to feel fulfilled. The divorce destroyed that inertia. It forced me to either collapse or transform, and somehow I managed to transform." "Somehow," Marcus repeated with a slight smile. As if it was luck rather than deliberate choice and consistent effort. "You give yourself too little credit for what you've built here, Natalie. The work you do, the person you've become, that's not accident or fortune. That's you choosing every day to move forward instead of staying stuck in the past." The sincerity in his voice created a moment of crystalline clarity. I was falling for Marcus Chen. Had been falling for months, probably, in small increments of respect and admiration and genuine enjoyment of his company. And based on the way he was looking at me now, the feeling was mutual. The realization should have terrified me, coming barely 2 years after a divorce that had shattered my ability to trust. Instead, it felt right. Natural. Like something that had been growing quietly until it couldn't be ignored any longer. Marcus, I started, not sure what I was about to say but needing to acknowledge what was happening between us. I know, he interrupted gently. I feel it too. But maybe we should wait until we're not our employer and employee, until we're back in normal circumstances rather than this retreat atmosphere. I don't want to complicate things at work, and I don't want either of us to make decisions we might regret when we're back in reality. His restraint was probably wise, but disappointment still fluttered through me. You're right, I agreed, trying to match his rationality while my heart argued otherwise. Workplace relationships are complicated, and we've both built too much at Catalyst to risk it on something that might not work out. That's not what I said, Marcus corrected, leaning slightly closer. I said wait until after this retreat, not never. I'm not worried about it not working out, Natalie. I'm worried about rushing into something important and not giving it the attention and space it deserves. When we do this, and I very much want us to do this, I want it to be deliberate and thoughtful, not impulsive. The distinction mattered. This wasn't rejection or hesitation about me specifically. This was someone being intentional about something he valued. That alone differentiated Marcus from Ryan in crucial ways. Ryan had pursued what he wanted with single-minded focus on his own desires, regardless of collateral damage. Marcus was considering implications and respecting boundaries even when doing so required restraint. Okay, I said, feeling both frustrated and deeply appreciative of his approach. We wait until we're back in Austin. But then we talk about this honestly instead of just letting it remain unspoken tension. Deal, Marcus agreed, extending his hand with mock formality before pulling me into a hug that lasted several heartbeats longer than casual friendship would dictate. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze of awareness. Every interaction with Marcus felt charged with new significance. Casual touches while passing in the kitchen. Eye contact across the room during group discussions. The careful distance we maintained to avoid feeding office gossip about something that hadn't even officially begun yet. It was both frustrating and oddly delicious, this phase of acknowledged mutual interest without action, like the best kind of anticipation. Back in Austin the following week, work continued as normal on the surface while everything beneath had fundamentally shifted. Marcus and I maintained professional boundaries during office hours, but our Thursday evening conversations took on new dimensions. We talked about what we wanted from life, from relationships, from the future we were each building. We shared histories and vulnerabilities, building foundation for something more substantial than initial attraction. 3 weeks after the retreat, Marcus asked me to dinner. Not takeout in the office or group outings with coworkers, but an actual date at a nice restaurant in downtown Austin. I spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing an outfit, wanting to look nice without appearing like I'd tried too hard, eventually settling on a simple dress that made me feel confident and comfortable. Dinner was easy and natural, conversation flowing like it always did between us, but with the added thrill of acknowledged romantic interest. Marcus talked about his vision for Catalyst's future, asking my opinion on strategic decisions in a way that made clear he valued my input as genuine partnership rather than just seeking validation for predetermined choices. I shared my own ambitions for my career, tentative ideas about maybe teaching design eventually or consulting for nonprofits, dreams I hadn't fully articulated even to myself before that night. As we walked back to where we'd parked, Marcus took my hand, the gesture simple but significant. I should probably tell you that I've wanted to do this for months, he admitted. Take you to dinner, hold your hand, see if this thing between us is as real as it feels. But I kept talking myself out of it because of work complications and your recent divorce and a dozen other rational concerns. What changed? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. I realized that waiting for the perfect moment when everything is simple and risk-free meant potentially never taking the chance at all, he said. Life doesn't offer guarantees. All we can do is make thoughtful choices about what risks are worth taking. And you, Natalie Parker, are absolutely worth the risk. Our relationship unfolded gradually, both of us cautious about rushing into something that felt increasingly important. We kept things quiet at work initially, not out of shame but from a shared desire to let our connection develop without the pressure of office scrutiny. Eventually, though, the secret became impossible and unnecessary to maintain. We told the team during a company meeting, framing it honestly and professionally, and were met with reactions ranging from genuine happiness to knowing smiles that suggested we'd been fooling exactly nobody. Dating Marcus was fundamentally different from any relationship I'd experienced before. There was an easiness to it, a lack of performance or pretense that felt revolutionary after years of trying to mold myself into what Ryan wanted. Marcus appreciated qualities about me that my ex-husband had tolerated at best or criticized at worst. My tendency to get lost in creative problems for hours without realizing time had passed, something Ryan had called impractical, Marcus described as one of my greatest strengths. My habit of asking questions that cut to emotional cores beneath surface interactions, which Ryan had dismissed as overthinking, Marcus valued as emotional intelligence that made me exceptional at client work. We both approached the relationship as a partnership between equals rather than one person accommodating the other's needs. When Marcus had to work late on a critical deadline, I brought dinner to the office and worked on my own projects alongside him. When I needed to travel to meet with a potential client in Houston, Marcus encouraged me to take the lead rather than suggesting he come along to lend authority. We celebrated each other's victories without competition or resentment. We supported each other through challenges without either of us becoming the perpetual caretaker or the perpetual problem. 6 months into our relationship, Marcus started talking seriously about an idea that had been percolating for years. He wanted to launch a separate division of Catalyst Solutions focused specifically on technology accessibility for underserved communities. Not just designing websites for nonprofits, but creating tools and platforms that addressed the digital divide in meaningful ways. Educational software for underfunded schools. Communication platforms for community organizations. Digital literacy programs for populations being left behind as technology became increasingly essential to basic life functions. The need is enormous, he explained one evening as we sat on my back porch, his laptop open with research and proposals spread across the small table. There are entire communities in Austin, let alone across Texas and the country, that are effectively locked out of opportunities because they lack either access to technology or the skills to use it effectively. We have the expertise to address that, but it would require significant investment and infrastructure we don't currently have. I listened as he outlined his vision, watching his face animate with enthusiasm as he described the potential impact. This wasn't about building a profitable business venture. This was about using technical skills to address social inequity in tangible ways. It was ambitious and idealistic and exactly the kind of thing that made me fall deeper in love with him. What's stopping you? I asked, though I suspected the answer involved the usual constraints of funding and capacity. Money, mainly, Marcus admitted. To do this right would require hiring specialized staff, developing infrastructure, and committing resources before we'd see any return on investment. Traditional investors won't touch something like this because the profit margins are minimal. And bootstrapping it ourselves would mean diverting resources from Catalyst's core business, which could jeopardize everything we've built. We spent hours that evening brainstorming possibilities. Grant funding from foundations focused on education and equity. Partnership with universities that might see value in real-world application of research. A hybrid model where profitable client work subsidized the community-focused initiatives. Nothing felt quite right, each option coming with compromises that would dilute the vision or create unsustainable dependencies. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Patricia Langford, whose nonprofit website I'd redesigned years earlier, reached out about an opportunity she thought Marcus should know about. A major technology foundation was launching a competitive grant program for social impact ventures that addressed digital equity. The grants were substantial, designed to fund not just pilot programs but sustainable operations, and the foundation's values aligned perfectly with what Marcus was envisioning. The application process is rigorous, Patricia warned during a coffee meeting where she'd invited both Marcus and me. They want detailed business plans, evidence of capability, community partnerships, and a sustainability model that shows how the venture becomes self-supporting after initial funding. But if you're serious about this accessibility initiative, this could be the opportunity that makes it possible. Marcus and I looked at each other across the coffee shop table, a moment of unspoken communication passing between us. This was the chance he'd been waiting for. The question was whether Catalyst had the capacity and credentials to compete against likely hundreds of other applicants. "We're serious," Marcus said with quiet determination. "Tell me what we need to do." The next 3 months consumed us. Marcus took the lead on developing the business plan and technical specifications, while I focused on the narrative and presentation elements that would make the application compelling. We recruited Patricia and several other nonprofit leaders as community partners, documenting the need through their first-hand experience. We conducted research into similar initiatives, learning from their successes and failures. We built financial models showing how the venture could eventually sustain itself through a combination of sliding scale fees, grant funding, and contracts with school districts and social service agencies. The application deadline fell on the same week as Catalyst's 3rd anniversary. We submitted the proposal with hours to spare, both of us exhausted but cautiously hopeful. The foundation's website indicated they'd notify applicants within 3 months, a waiting period that felt interminable. Marcus tried to focus on regular client work, but I could see his mind constantly drifting back to the possibilities if the grant came through. Life continued around the uncertainty. Catalyst kept growing, necessitating a move to a larger office space with room for the expanding team. I was promoted again, this time to creative director, overseeing all design work and mentoring a team of 5 designers. Marcus and I moved in together, combining our households into a small house in South Austin with a yard big enough for a vegetable garden and a home office where we could both work without tripping over each other. The domesticity of shared life revealed new dimensions of our compatibility. We developed routines and rhythms that worked for both of us. Morning coffee on the porch before heading to the office together. Evening walks around the neighborhood after dinner. Weekend mornings at the farmer's market, selecting ingredients for meals we'd cook together. It was ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, the kind of comfortable partnership I'd always heard about but never experienced. Kelsey visited again that spring, staying for a long weekend and getting to know Marcus properly rather than just meeting him briefly. I watched them interact over dinner at our house, Marcus telling stories that made her laugh, Kelsey interrogating him with the protective intensity of a best friend evaluating whether someone was worthy of her person. Later, while Marcus cleaned up the kitchen, Kelsey pulled me onto the porch. "Okay, I approve," she announced without preamble. "He's nothing like Ryan. He actually listens when you talk instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He mentions your work like he's proud of it rather than threatened by it. And the way he looks at you, Nat, it's not like he's admiring a possession. It's like he's genuinely delighted by your existence." Her observation made me realize how true it was. Marcus's affection felt like celebration rather than ownership. He wanted me to succeed not because my success reflected well on him but because he genuinely wanted me to thrive. When I had victories at work, he asked questions about how I'd achieved them and what I'd learned, interested in my process rather than just the outcome. When I struggled or failed, his support came without judgment or unsolicited advice unless I specifically requested input. "I think I might marry him," I said quietly, the words surprising me as they emerged. I hadn't consciously been thinking about marriage, still carrying wariness from how spectacularly my first one had failed. But somewhere along the way, that fear had transformed into cautious hope that maybe, with the right person, partnership could be what it was supposed to be. "Does he know that?" Kelsey asked with a knowing smile. "Not yet," I admitted. "We haven't really talked about long-term future plans. We're both still focused on building our careers and making the business work. Marriage feels like something that can wait until we're more established." Kelsey gave me a look that suggested I was overthinking things. Or marriage is acknowledging that you want to build those futures together rather than as separate individuals who happen to be dating. But that's your call to make. Just don't wait because you're afraid of repeating past mistakes. Marcus isn't Ryan. This relationship isn't that relationship. Trust what you're actually experiencing instead of what you're scared might happen. The grant notification arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. Marcus was in a client meeting when the email came through, and I saw it first since we'd listed both of us as contacts on the application. My hands shook as I opened the message, scanning quickly for the verdict buried in formal foundation language. We were finalists. Not winners yet, but selected as one of 10 ventures invited to Austin for final presentations to the foundation's board. The email outlined expectations for the presentation, logistics for the visit, and a timeline leading to final decisions in August. It was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, moving from abstract possibility to concrete opportunity with new pressure attached. Marcus emerged from his meeting to find me standing frozen in the hallway, phone clutched in my hand. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, reading distress in my posture. "Nothing's wrong," I managed, voice shaky with adrenaline. "We're finalists. For the grant. They want us to present to their board in 3 weeks." His expression cycled through disbelief, elation, and then immediate strategic focus. 3 weeks to prepare a presentation that determines whether this whole vision becomes reality or stays an unrealized dream, he said, already mentally calculating what needed to happen. No pressure at all. We spent those 3 weeks refining everything. Marcus rehearsed the business case until he could present it in his sleep, anticipating every possible question or objection. I designed visual materials that told the story emotionally while supporting it with data. We practiced the presentation dozens of times, timing it precisely, adjusting language and emphasis based on mock feedback from Patricia and other advisors. By the time we flew to the Foundation's headquarters, we were as prepared as humanly possible while also recognizing that much would depend on factors beyond our control. The Foundation's offices occupied several floors of a building in downtown Dallas, sleek and professional with the understated wealth of an organization that had billions in assets to deploy strategically. We were scheduled third out of the 10 finalists, arriving early to observe the first 2 presentations if possible. The Foundation didn't allow that, keeping each finalist isolated until their slot, probably to prevent later presenters from adjusting based on what worked or failed for those who went before. Waiting was agonizing. Marcus paced the small green room they provided, running through his opening remarks under his breath. I reviewed our materials one final time, looking for any error or weakness we might have missed. Neither of us spoke much, both lost in our own pre-performance anxiety rituals. Finally, our names were called. We entered a conference room where 8 Foundation board members sat around a large table, their expressions professionally neutral. Marcus began the presentation with confidence, outlining the scope of digital inequity in Texas and how Catalyst's proposed venture would address specific gaps. I advanced slides at precise moments, the visual materials reinforcing his verbal narrative. We'd choreographed it carefully, a genuine partnership rather than one person leading while the other assisted. The questions that followed were sharp and probing. Board members challenged our financial projections, our timeline for achieving sustainability, our metrics for measuring impact. They asked about scalability and replicability, about how we'd maintain quality while growing, about what would happen if initial results didn't meet projections. Marcus handled the business questions with authority while I fielded queries about design methodology and user experience principles that would guide our work. One board member, a woman who'd been taking notes throughout, asked the question that felt most significant. Why should we trust that you can execute this vision? You're a small firm without experience operating at the scale this grant would require. What makes you believe you won't fail? Marcus and I looked at each other briefly before he answered. You shouldn't trust that we won't fail, he said with disarming honesty. Ventures like this carry inherent risk, and anyone who claims otherwise is either naive or dishonest. What you should trust is that we'll fail forward if we do fail. That we'll learn, adapt, and persist until we figure out what works. Our track record shows consistent growth achieved through exactly that process of iteration and refinement. We're not promising perfection. We're promising dedication and the capability to translate mission into operational reality. The board members nodded, appreciating the candor. We finished the presentation and left, having no sense of whether we'd succeeded or fallen short. 8 other ventures would present after us, each presumably bringing their own strengths and vision. All we could do was wait. The Foundation promised decisions within 2 weeks. Those weeks dragged with excruciating slowness. Marcus and I tried to focus on regular work, but our attention kept drifting back to possibilities and contingency plans. If we got the grant, Catalyst would transform dramatically, adding new staff and infrastructure and taking on challenges unlike anything we'd attempted before. If we didn't, life would continue as it had been, which was good but not the leap forward we'd been envisioning. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Marcus was driving back from a client's site when his phone rang with an unfamiliar Dallas number. He pulled over to answer, putting it on speaker so I could listen from the passenger seat. The Foundation's program director was on the line, her voice warm but professionally composed. "Mr. Chen, Ms. Parker, I'm pleased to inform you that the board has selected Catalyst Solutions as a grant recipient. We were impressed by your presentation, your track record, and particularly the authenticity of your partnership and commitment to community impact. The full award details will come via formal letter, but I wanted to let you know personally that you'll be receiving $500,000 over 2 years to launch your digital equity initiative." Marcus and I sat in stunned silence for a moment before finding our voices to thank her. The call ended with logistics about next steps and formal announcements, but I barely processed the details. $500,000. 2 years of funding to build something meaningful from the ground up. Validation that our vision resonated with people who'd seen countless proposals and chosen ours as worth investing in. After we hung up, Marcus and I looked at each other in the confined space of his car, pulled over on the side of a random Austin street, and started laughing. Not polite chuckles but deep, relieved, slightly hysterical laughter that came from released tension and genuine joy and disbelief that this was actually happening. "We did it," Marcus said when the laughter finally subsided. "We actually convinced a major foundation to give us $500,000 to pursue this crazy idea." "It's not crazy," I corrected, still grinning. "It's ambitious and necessary and exactly what we're capable of building." They didn't take a risk on us. They made a smart investment. The announcement went public 2 weeks later, generating local news coverage about Austin startups addressing social impact and inquiries from organizations interested in partnering or participating. Catalyst's profile elevated overnight, our team fielding interview requests and meeting inquiries that exceeded our capacity to respond. Marcus handled the attention with grace, always deflecting credit to the team and emphasizing that we'd accomplished nothing yet except earning the opportunity to try. Behind the scenes, the real work intensified. We had to hire specialized staff, including developers with experience in educational technology and community outreach coordinators who could build relationships with the organizations we aimed to serve. We needed to establish partnerships with school districts and community centers. We had to develop curriculum and training materials. The grant money was substantial, but it had to stretch across 2 years while we built something sustainable enough to continue after initial funding ran out. I took on a larger leadership role in the new venture, officially titled Director of Community Engagement and Design. The position let me combine my design expertise with the relationship-building skills I developed working with nonprofit clients. Marcus focused on overall strategy and technical infrastructure while I ensured that what we built actually met the needs of the communities we aimed to serve. It was the most challenging work I'd ever undertaken, requiring skills I had to develop rapidly, but it was also the most fulfilling. 8 months into the grant period, we launched our first pilot program at an elementary school in East Austin, an area with high poverty rates and limited technology access. We provided tablets loaded with educational software, trained teachers on integrating technology into their curriculum, and offered evening workshops for parents on digital literacy. The program started small, just 3 classrooms, with plans to expand based on what we learned. The impact was immediate and visible. Students who'd struggled with traditional teaching methods flourished with interactive learning tools. Parents who'd never felt comfortable with technology gained confidence through patient, judgment-free instruction. Teachers reported better engagement and improved assessment results. We documented everything meticulously, gathering data and stories that would inform both our expansion plans and our eventual sustainability arguments. Marcus and I found ourselves working longer hours than ever before, the line between professional and personal life blurring as we ate dinner while reviewing program metrics or spent Sunday morning strategizing about staffing needs. But unlike the late nights during my marriage to Ryan, which had felt like abandonment and neglect, working alongside Marcus felt like partnership. We were building something together, both of us equally invested, both of us contributing according to our strengths. One evening, about a year into the grant funding, we sat on our back porch after a particularly long day of meetings and site visits. The program had expanded to 5 schools, and we were fielding interest from districts across Central Texas. The success was gratifying but also overwhelming, raising questions about how to scale responsibly. "I've been thinking about something," Marcus said, breaking a comfortable silence. About us, and what we're building, and what comes next. I looked over at him, noting the serious expression on his face. What kind of thinking? He set down his beer and turned to face me fully. The kind where I realize I want to be intentional about our future instead of just letting it unfold by default. We've been together almost 2 years now. We live together, we work together, we're building this venture together. We're already partners in every meaningful way except legally. And I find myself wanting that legal partnership too. Not for practical reasons, though there are practical benefits, but because I want to declare publicly that I choose you, deliberately and permanently, as the person I'm building my life with. It took me a moment to process that Marcus was proposing, though not in the traditional sense of a surprise with a ring. This was characteristically him, thoughtful, direct, treating marriage as a decision we'd make together rather than a question with only one acceptable answer. Are you asking me to marry you? I said, wanting to be clear about what was happening. I'm saying I want to marry you, he clarified. If that's something you want too. I know marriage didn't work out well for you before, and I understand if you need more time or have reservations. But I also know that I've never been more certain about anything than I am about wanting to spend my life with you, building things that matter alongside someone I respect and love and genuinely like spending time with. I thought about Ryan, about the wedding we'd had that felt more like performance than commitment, about the marriage that had slowly revealed itself as unequal partnership where my needs came perpetually second. Then I thought about Marcus, about how he challenged me to grow while accepting exactly who I was, about how our successes felt shared and our struggles felt manageable because we faced them together. Yes, I said simply. I want to marry you. Not because it's the next logical step or because we've been together long enough. But because you're right that I want to declare deliberately that I choose this partnership, this life we're building, you. We married 3 months later at the same courthouse where I'd finalized my divorce from Ryan, a deliberate choice to reclaim that space with better memories. Kelsey flew in to serve as witness, along with Patricia and several Catalyst team members. Marcus's parents came despite their continued ambivalence about his career choices, warming to me gradually over the weekend as they saw how genuinely happy their son was. We kept the ceremony simple, speaking vows we'd written ourselves about partnership and growth and choosing each other daily rather than assuming marriage was a permanent state that required no further effort. The email arrived on an ordinary Wednesday morning, forwarded by our office manager with a note asking if Marcus and I were interested in speaking at an industry conference. I almost deleted it reflexively, having declined dozens of similar invitations over the past year as our digital equity program gained visibility. Public speaking had never been my strength, and between running the program and managing Catalyst's design team, I had little bandwidth for additional commitments. But something made me actually read the invitation. The Technology and Social Impact Summit was being held in Seattle, a major annual gathering where nonprofits, foundations, and tech companies discussed leveraging technology for community benefit. They wanted Marcus and me to present a case study on our digital equity initiative, specifically how we'd structured it for sustainability and measurable impact. The speaking slot was prestigious, the kind of platform that could attract additional funding partners and amplify our work's visibility. Seattle. I hadn't been back since I'd loaded my car and driven away nearly 4 years ago. The city felt like another lifetime, a place where a different version of me had existed. I'd successfully avoided it, declining the few work opportunities that would have required travel there, keeping my new life geographically and emotionally separate from my past. Now here was an invitation that felt professionally important but personally complicated. Marcus found me staring at my computer screen, clearly conflicted. "What's wrong?" he asked, reading the tension in my shoulders. I turned the monitor so he could see the invitation. "Major conference wants us to present our work. It's a good opportunity for visibility and potential partnerships. The problem is location." He scanned the email, understanding dawning on his face. "Seattle. You haven't been back since you left." Intentionally, I confirmed. I built this entire life specifically to have nothing to do with that city and the people there. Going back feels like voluntarily walking into territory where I don't want to be. Marcus pulled up a chair, giving the question serious consideration rather than dismissing my concerns. "What specifically worries you about going back?" Running into your ex? Seeing places that hold bad memories? Or something else? I thought about it honestly. I think it's the fear that going back will somehow diminish what I've built here. Like Seattle represents who I was when I felt small and inadequate, and returning might resurrect those feelings even though intellectually I know I'm not that person anymore. You know that's not how it works, right? Marcus said gently. You don't become less of who you are now by visiting a place where you used to be someone different. If anything, going back from a position of strength could be the final proof that you've moved beyond that chapter. He was right, annoyingly so. The fear was irrational, based on outdated beliefs about myself rather than current reality. I was successful, respected in my field, happily married to someone who valued me as an equal partner. Ryan's opinion of me no longer held any power unless I gave it power by avoiding anything connected to our shared past. We should accept, I decided. It's good for the program, and I refuse to let geography hold me back from opportunities just because I have unpleasant history there. The conference was scheduled for late October, giving us 3 months to prepare. We spent hours refining our presentation, crafting it to be both informative for practitioners who might replicate our model and compelling for potential funders who could support expansion. The program had exceeded initial projections, serving 12 schools across 3 districts with documented improvements in both student engagement and educational outcomes. We had data, stories, and a sustainability model that was beginning to prove itself viable. The presentation wrote itself once we organized our thoughts coherently. As the conference date approached, I felt increasing anxiety that had nothing to do with public speaking. Seattle meant potential encounters with people from my previous life. The city wasn't small, but the professional community could be surprisingly interconnected. What if I ran into Ryan? What if he was attending the same conference? What if he saw my success and felt entitled to claim some credit for pushing me to leave and reinvent myself? Kelsey, during one of our regular calls, had different concerns. What if you see him and feel nothing? She asked. What if the person who once had the power to devastate you is now just some guy you used to know? That might be more disorienting than anger or hurt. Her insight proved prophetic. We flew into Seattle 2 days before the conference, wanting time to acclimate and do final preparation without jet lag affecting our performance. Marcus had never been to the Pacific Northwest, so I played tour guide, showing him Pike Place Market and taking him to restaurants I'd loved. It felt surreal walking streets that had once been daily routes, now seeing them through the dual lens of nostalgia and detachment. The city was familiar but foreign, like returning to your childhood home and finding it smaller than you remembered. The conference opened with a reception the evening before presentations began. The venue was a hotel near the waterfront, upscale and crowded with the kind of people who moved comfortably in professional spaces where technology and social impact intersected. Marcus and I worked the room together, introducing ourselves to potential partners and reconnecting with people we'd met at other events. I was deep in conversation with a foundation program officer about educational technology funding when I heard a voice I recognized. Natalie? Natalie Parker? I turned to find Diana Hayes, Ryan's mother, standing a few feet away holding a wine glass and looking at me with an expression mixing surprise and something else I couldn't quite identify. She looked older, more gray in her hair, but still carried herself with the same rigid posture that had always made me feel judged in her presence. Diana, I acknowledged neutrally, my mind racing through implications of her presence. If she was here, was Ryan also attending? Was this about to become the awkward encounter I'd been dreading? I almost didn't recognize you, she said, moving closer with the determined purpose of someone who decided to engage regardless of potential discomfort. You look so different. More polished. Are you here for the conference? I'm speaking tomorrow, I replied, keeping my tone professional. Presenting a case study on a digital equity program my husband and I developed in Austin. Her eyebrows rose slightly at the word husband. You remarried. How nice for you. The pleasantry sounded automatic, programmed courtesy without genuine warmth. I'm here representing a foundation Ryan and I established. We fund educational initiatives in underserved communities. He would have come himself, but he's dealing with some business complications. The mention of Ryan funding educational equity had a bitter irony to it, given that he dismissed my design work as frivolous compared to his real estate development. But I maintained composure, refusing to show any reaction that might suggest I still cared about his choices or evolution. Marcus appeared at my elbow, sensing tension or simply done with his own conversation. I introduced them, watching Diana assess my husband with the calculating eye she'd once turned on Ryan's professional associates. Marcus Chen, this is Diana Hayes. Her son was married to me before, back when I lived in Seattle. Pleasure to meet you, Marcus said with easy politeness, his hand finding the small of my back in a subtle gesture of support. Natalie's mentioned her time in Seattle, though usually in the context of being glad she left. Diana's smile tightened at the implied criticism. Yes, well, sometimes relationships run their course. I understand Ryan and Natalie simply wanted different things from life. No fault on either side, really. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. She'd actively worked to end my marriage, encouraged Ryan's affair, helped him plan his exit strategy, and now presented it as mutual incompatibility discovered through natural relationship evolution. I could have called out the lie, created a scene, forced acknowledgement of her role in the betrayal. Instead, I felt only tired disinterest in relitigating ancient history. Relationships do run their course, I agreed blandly. Fortunately, mine and Ryan's ending freed us both to find more compatible partners and build lives better suited to our actual values. I hope he's found happiness in whatever direction his life has taken. The words were generous and completely sincere. I genuinely didn't wish Ryan harm. I simply didn't think about him at all anymore unless directly prompted. He was a character from my past who no longer influenced my present. Diana seemed unsettled by my lack of bitterness or interest in details about Ryan's current situation. He's doing very well, actually. Still in real estate, though he's shifted focus somewhat. And he and Vanessa married, as I'm sure you knew. I hadn't known and didn't particularly care, but Diana was clearly waiting for a reaction. I'm happy for them, I said with perfect honesty. I hope they've built something that works for both of them. The conversation limped along for a few more minutes before Diana excused herself, clearly disappointed that I hadn't provided the drama or lingering pain she'd perhaps expected. After she left, Marcus squeezed my hand gently. You okay? He asked quietly. That seemed loaded. I'm fine, I realized with some surprise. She thought she'd get a reaction, maybe some sign that I'm still affected by what happened. But mostly I just feel sorry for her. She's still invested in narratives from 4 years ago while I've moved on completely. The conference sessions the next day were energizing, full of people doing genuinely important work at the intersection of technology and social good. Marcus and I attended presentations by other organizations, taking notes on approaches we might adapt and connections we should pursue. Our own presentation was scheduled for late afternoon, a prime slot that suggested the conference organizers considered our work significant enough to warrant prominent placement. We'd rehearsed extensively, but standing backstage waiting to be introduced, I felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety. Marcus must have sensed it because he took my hand briefly, squeezing once before releasing it. Remember, he said quietly, we're not here to impress anyone or prove anything. We're here to share what we've learned so others can learn from our experience. That's it. Just tell the truth about what we built and how we built it. The introduction came, and we walked onto the small stage to polite applause. The room was perhaps 2/3 full, maybe 150 people interested enough in digital equity to attend our session instead of competing presentations. I scanned the audience briefly as we settled in, and my eyes caught on a familiar face in the third row. Ryan. Sitting next to a woman I recognized from photos as Vanessa, both of them looking at me with expressions I couldn't quite read from the stage. So he had come to the conference after all, despite what his mother had said about business complications. And he'd specifically chosen to attend our presentation out of what must be dozens of concurrent sessions. For a moment, I froze, caught off guard despite having mentally prepared for this possibility. Then Marcus began speaking, his calm voice launching into our prepared introduction, and I forced myself to focus on the presentation rather than the audience. We'd structured it as a dialogue, alternating who spoke rather than one person lecturing, our natural back and forth illustrating the partnership approach we'd taken to the work itself. I talked about the initial needs assessment, about listening to communities before designing solutions, about the importance of treating the people we served as collaborators rather than recipients of charity. Marcus detailed the technical infrastructure and sustainability model, showing how we'd built something designed to outlast initial grant funding. We shared data on student outcomes, on parent engagement, on teacher satisfaction. We showed photos of kids using the technology, of parents in digital literacy workshops, of teachers integrating new tools into their curriculum. The presentation flowed smoothly, our timing perfect from extensive practice. When we opened for questions, hands shot up immediately. People wanted to know about funding sources, about how we'd navigated school district bureaucracy, about our metrics for measuring success beyond test scores. We answered thoughtfully, honestly acknowledging challenges and uncertainties alongside our successes. Then Ryan's hand went up. Marcus called on him, not recognizing him as anyone significant. "Question for Ms. Parker," Ryan said, his voice carrying across the room. "You mentioned the importance of authentic partnership in this work. Can you talk about how you developed that collaborative approach? It seems core to your model's success." The question was innocuous on its surface, but I heard the subtext. Ryan was asking about partnership because he knew our marriage had failed due to lack of it. He was publicly acknowledging, intentionally or not, that I'd learned something essential he hadn't taught me. Partnership requires viewing people as equals with valuable contributions regardless of traditional credentials or power dynamics, I answered, looking directly at him. It means checking your ego and genuinely listening to perspectives different from your own. It means being willing to be wrong, to adapt your vision based on input from people with different expertise or lived experience. I paused, then added, I learned that lesson gradually, sometimes through negative examples that showed me what partnership isn't. Understanding what you don't want can be as valuable as knowing what you do want. A ripple of recognition went through the audience. People who worked in social impact understood the tension between helper and helped, between those with resources and those with needs. They heard my answer as addressing community partnership, which it was. But Ryan would hear it as addressing our failed marriage, which it also was. The rest of the Q&A proceeded normally, ending with enthusiastic applause and a small crowd gathering around us afterward with follow-up questions and business card exchanges. I saw Ryan and Vanessa approach, waiting politely while we finished other conversations. Finally, they stood before us, an awkward quartet with complicated history. "That was an impressive presentation," Ryan said, extending his hand to Marcus first, then to me. "Really comprehensive and thoughtfully structured. You've clearly built something meaningful." "Thank you," I replied, matching his formal tone. "I appreciate you taking the time to attend." Vanessa spoke for the first time, her voice carefully modulated. "Your partnership is obviously strong. That came through clearly in how you presented together. It's nice to see you've found that kind of collaboration." The comment felt loaded, possibly an acknowledgement that she and Ryan hadn't found similar equilibrium. I noticed she looked tired, expensive clothes not quite concealing an underlying stress. Ryan's smile seemed practiced, not reaching his eyes the way genuine happiness would. "We've been fortunate," Marcus said easily, his arms sliding around my waist in a gesture both affectionate and claiming. "Building something you both care about with someone you respect makes the hard work feel worthwhile." Ryan's eyes flicked to Marcus's arm around me, then back to my face. "I wanted to say, Natalie, that I'm glad things worked out for you. Genuinely. I know our ending was difficult, but it seems like you've landed somewhere that suits you better." The apology was implicit rather than explicit, as close as Ryan could probably come to acknowledging that he'd hurt me and that I deserved better. I could have demanded more, could have forced him to articulate exactly what he was apologizing for and to name his actions clearly. Instead, I chose to let it be enough. I agreed simply. "And I hope you found the same. Life has a way of working out if we're willing to learn from our mistakes and make better choices going forward." We chatted for a few more minutes, the conversation painfully polite and carefully neutral. I learned that Ryan's foundation work was new, a pivot from pure profit-driven real estate after the market had turned difficult. He'd started it with his mother's money, trying to create social impact while maintaining income flow. Reading between lines, I suspected his career hadn't delivered the endless upward trajectory he'd expected when he traded me for someone he considered more ambitious. Vanessa was quieter, deferring to Ryan in ways that felt familiar from my own marriage. She'd achieved the partnership my mother and Diana had engineered, but it didn't seem to have brought the fulfillment that had been promised. They were successful on paper, doing work that sounded meaningful, but something essential seemed to be missing. They looked like people going through motions rather than building something they genuinely believed in. When we finally extracted ourselves from the conversation, Marcus and I walked back to our hotel in the cool Seattle evening. We didn't speak for several blocks, both processing what had just occurred. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "That was your ex-husband." "That was my ex-husband," I confirmed. "You didn't tell me he'd be here." "I didn't know he would be. His mother said he wasn't coming." Though I'd mentally prepared for the possibility. We walked another block before Marcus asked the question I knew was coming. "How did it feel? Seeing him, hearing him try to apologize in that inadequate way, watching him realize that you'd built something he couldn't dismiss or diminish?" I thought about it carefully, wanting to answer honestly. "It felt anticlimactic," I finally said. I'd built it up in my head as this potentially devastating encounter, but the reality was just sad. He looked diminished somehow, not because he's failing but because he's still operating from the same limited playbook. Chasing status, trying to prove worth through accomplishments, partnering with someone based on what she brings to his brand rather than who she is as a person. "And you felt?" Marcus pressed. "Grateful," I said, the word surprising me as it emerged but feeling true. Grateful that his betrayal forced me to leave, because otherwise I might still be there, making myself smaller to fit his vision of what a wife should be. Grateful that the relationship ended before I wasted more years trying to become someone I wasn't. Grateful that the worst thing that ever happened to me led directly to the best things. We reached our hotel, but instead of going inside, Marcus steered us to a bench overlooking Elliott Bay. The water was dark except for reflected city lights, ferries moving like illuminated jewels across the surface. He was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I need to tell you something," he said, his tone serious enough to make me nervous. "Watching you up there today, presenting work we built together, handling your ex with grace and confidence, I realized something. I've been holding back part of myself, protecting against potential loss by not being completely vulnerable. But you deserve someone who's all in, not someone hedging against possible future pain." I wasn't sure where this was going, but I stayed quiet, letting him work through whatever he needed to say. "I love you completely," Marcus continued. "Not the careful, measured love of someone trying to avoid getting hurt. The messy, terrifying, all-in love where your happiness matters more than my self-protection. Seeing Ryan today made me realize that the tragedy wasn't just that he betrayed you. It was that he never loved you the way you deserved, never saw your full value, never gave you the kind of partnership that brings out the best in both people." He turned to face me fully, taking both my hands. "I see your value, Natalie. I see your talent and intelligence and emotional depth and creative vision. I see how you make everything you touch better through your attention and care. And I want to spend the rest of my life building things with you, not because we make a good professional team, though we do, but because you make me want to be better than I would be alone." Tears were streaming down my face, but I was smiling. "I love you too," I managed. "The all-in, terrifying kind. The kind where your success brings me genuine joy and your struggles make me want to fight beside you. The kind where partnership isn't compromise but multiplication." We sat there on that bench overlooking water in the city where my first marriage had died, acknowledging the depth of what we'd built together. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd come back to Seattle dreading encounters with my past, and instead I'd found confirmation of how completely I'd moved beyond it. Ryan's presence at our presentation hadn't diminished my success or resurrected old pain. It had simply provided contrast, showing me the difference between what I'd settled for and what I'd found. The flight back to Austin the next morning felt different from the drive away 4 years earlier. Then, I'd been fleeing, running from pain toward uncertain possibility. Now I was returning home, to a city I'd chosen deliberately, to work I believed in, to a partner who valued me completely, to a life I'd built intentionally rather than accepting by default. Kelsey called as we landed, eager for details about the conference and any dramatic encounters. I told her about seeing Ryan and Diana, about the presentation's success, about the recognition that my past no longer held any power over my present. "So you finally got your revenge," she said with satisfaction. "Showing up successful and happy while he's stuck in the same patterns." "It wasn't revenge," I corrected gently. "Revenge would mean I built this life to prove something to him. I built it for me, because I wanted something real and meaningful and authentic. That he happened to witness it was incidental. His opinion doesn't define my success." "That might be the most growth-indicating thing you've ever said," Kelsey observed. The Natalie who left Seattle would have cared deeply about what Ryan thought. The Natalie who returned didn't need his validation because she'd found something more valuable, her own. She was right. The transformation wasn't about becoming more successful or conventionally accomplished than my ex-husband. It was about discovering and building a life aligned with my actual values rather than performing a role someone else had written. Success wasn't measured by Ryan's regret or Diana's surprise. It was measured by my own sense of fulfillment and purpose. Marcus and I spent the flight planning the next phase of our digital equity program. The conference had generated new partnership opportunities and potential funding streams. We were positioned to expand beyond Austin, replicating our model in other Texas cities and possibly beyond. The work was challenging and uncertain, guaranteed to bring failures alongside successes, but we were building it together from shared vision and genuine partnership. That's what made all the difference. Not that I'd found success after failure, or happiness after heartbreak, or a better partner after a worse one. Those narratives were too simplistic. What mattered was that I'd learned to value myself independent of external validation, to build work that felt meaningful regardless of financial reward or prestigious recognition, to choose partnership that elevated rather than diminished. Sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is releasing you to find something better. Ryan's betrayal had been devastating at the time, but it had cracked open a life I'd settled into without examining whether it actually suited me. His dismissal of my worth had forced me to prove it to myself rather than seeking his approval. His choice of someone he considered stronger and more ambitious had freed me to find someone who valued different strengths altogether. I didn't wish Ryan harm, but I also didn't credit him with my transformation. He was simply the catalyst for change I'd needed but hadn't been brave enough to choose for myself. The actual work of rebuilding, of learning, of growing into someone I respected had been entirely my own effort, supported by people who believed in my potential even when I doubted it myself. As our plane descended into Austin, I looked out the window at the city spread below, its distinctive skyline and surrounding hills glowing in afternoon sun. This was home now, not because it was where I'd run to escape pain, but because it was where I'd chosen to plant roots and grow deliberately. Where I'd found work that mattered and people who valued me and a version of myself I was proud to be. That evening, back in our house with its vegetable garden and home office and accumulated evidence of shared life, Marcus and I sat on the back porch watching sunset paint the sky. We didn't talk about the conference or Ryan or vindication or revenge. We talked about ordinary things like what to have for dinner and whether we needed to water the tomatoes and which projects demanded attention the following week. This was the victory I'd never known to hope for when I'd fled Seattle with a broken heart and uncertain future. Not dramatic confrontation or public triumph, but the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived with someone who saw me clearly and chose me anyway. Not because I was perfect or impressive or more successful than alternatives, but because our partnership brought out the best in both of us. Sometimes the best revenge isn't showing someone what they lost. It's building something so fulfilling that you forget to care whether they notice. That's the freedom I'd found, the transformation that mattered more than any external validation could provide. I'd stopped performing for an audience that had never truly appreciated the show, and instead started living authentically for the only audience that ultimately mattered, myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.